what about what kinds of situations do people find themselves in that would be more of the classic hot executive functioning?
So things like anything to do with problematic behavior. So, for example, criminality is probably the most obvious one, um, in terms of getting in trouble with the law, um, setting fire to things, etc. Misbehaving in school. I had a whole list of them. But the sort of practical element to the theoretical narrative, I guess, is you can translate the effect because cold and hot operate on a scale.
Mhm.
It's a continuum, so you can kind of it's like a practical framework for basically plotting the effect of prenatal alcohol exposure on the brain, on the impact of executive functions, and then you can link different hot and cold executive functions to different symptoms.
Okay.
And then by doing so, you can identify basically what treatments people need, or even on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can start developing treatments tailored towards different effects that alcohol has on the brain. Is kind of the position I argue from.
Okay.
It's yeah, it's very interesting. It's yeah, I don't know how
So,
to explain it.
okay. So I find myself, I mean, my mind's just going, right? If an example of someone, you gave a good example of, like what it looks like in a kid or in criminality, but there's a huge space in between, right? I was never in trouble either in school or with the law, but so there's a lot of people like me who have never been close to those kinds of behaviors and yet still have this type of struggle where their impulses fail them, lead them to taking spontaneously deciding to go do something over lunch break
Yeah,
and not returning to work, right? Or until like mid afternoon when they should have been back, 2 hours previously and not realizing there's consequences to that,
yeah.
and being caught off guard by that. Would that be an example?
Yeah, you could class that as a hot executive function, I guess, to some degree, because there's a motivation to not go back because you might be preoccupied with, I don't know, going to the cinema instead or something like that. There's a
Hmm.
motivational factor for um, your decision to not go back
Hmm.
to work. But it's interesting as well. So when we were writing this paper, we noticed that obviously the theory is you have your cold, which is your lateral prefrontal cortex, which contains your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and your ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which are more your cold executive functions. And then you've got your hot executive functions, which is your orbital frontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. But it's kind of like a loop in between, and it bypasses, so one system to the other bypasses the brain region called the anterior cingulate cortex. And basically, to function optimally as a human, you need to use both cold
Hmm.
and hot executive
Hmm.
functions. Whereas prenatal alcohol exposure has shown to basically damage the anterior cingulate cortex. So these two systems also
Okay.
don't communicate between each other, and that's when you lead to sort of these.
That's very interesting. So I again, I would be very curious to go back and find out, is that specific part of the brain damaged regardless of gestational age at time of exposure? Or is it coincidental that most of the research study participants happen to have a similar time of exposure? You know
Yeah,
what I
that would
mean?
be an interesting question to answer, but that's another piece of research for someone to do.
Right? You don't want another PhD?
I'll settle for just the one.